So today we come to the end of our series that I've been calling Jesus in the Present Tense, where we have been exploring the 7 statements in the Gospel of John where Jesus says, I am something, where he's explaining about who he is in his life. I thought about recapping all of those 7 statements and giving you a synopsis of what they were, but then I thought, you know what, I'm not going to, because I've been getting pressure from the sound booth to cut the sermon length down. Last week they tell me it was over 40 minutes, and that's unacceptable. And so I thought, well, I won't do that. So I'm just going to tell you what the 7 statements are. They're only recorded in John. You can hear the 40-minute sermons online. They're not all 40 minutes, but some of last week's was. And so Jesus says this. He says, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I am the vine. They're all in the Gospel of John. No other gospel recorded those statements that Jesus made. It's interesting to me that John doesn't go anywhere with that after he shares these 7 statements. And so that's why I went to Matthew's Gospel to find what I'm calling the wrap-up of this series, where Jesus asks his disciples 2 questions that Pastor Sharon read this morning that I think are a great follow-up to this series of statements that Jesus makes about himself. I am the bread of life, the light of the world, the gate, the good shepherd, the resurrection and the life, the way, the truth, the life, the vine. You know, he spent lots of time teaching who he was. He spent lots of time demonstrating who he was to his disciples and his followers, and we have that recorded in the 4 Gospels, and we can read all of that, and all that's well and good. But if you don't have the most important question, if you haven't answered that question, if you haven't decided for yourself who Jesus is to you, what difference does it make who he says he is? And so in this passage this morning in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus asks first, who do the people say I am? And then he gets right to where he needs to go. And he says, who do you say I am? I grew up in a Christian home. I grew up in a Christian family. It wasn't a label we wore. It was a way of life. I went to church every Sunday. I knew before Sunday came that that's what I would be doing on Sunday, and it wasn't a choice that I had. It was an expectation in my house. And I'm not bitter about that. I rather enjoyed going. I got something out of going. But I understand where people could be bitter about being forced to go. I knew what we would be doing every Sunday morning. I knew that we would go to Sunday school, and then we would go to church, and then we would go to my grandparents' house, where all of the 4 siblings that my dad had, all 5 of them, and their spouses, and all of their children, all 14 grandchildren, would gather around the dining room and the kitchen table in my grandmother's house, and we would have a meal together. And I knew that there would be no fishing, because my grandfather believed that if you caught a fish, you had to clean a fish, and that was work on Sunday. And so you didn't work on Sunday, and so you didn't catch fish because you didn't want to have the temptation to clean them. And I also knew that there wouldn't be baseball or softball or anything like that. I knew that the kids would go off and play in the barn, and we would have all kinds of fun jumping from haymow to haymow in the barn. And I knew that the old folks would sit around chatting. And I knew that that's what we would do every week, and everybody would be there. There would be nobody that missed those family gatherings. I also knew where my parents and grandparents stood when it came to Jesus. I knew that Jesus was somebody who mattered to them. It wasn't just what they said with their lips, that Jesus was a way of life. Jesus was the way they lived their lives. They wanted other people to know that they believed in Jesus. Not because they wanted people to know they believed that, but because they wanted people to see that their lives were different, because Jesus made an impact in the way they lived their lives. They loved him, they followed him, and they wanted other people to know that. It mattered to them how they lived their lives. And there came a time in my life, and there will come a time in your life, maybe it's come already, maybe it's yet to come. It's a different time for all of us. For some of us, it's a time when we're young. So for some of us, it's a time when we're older. For some of us, we come back to that time. But there will come a time in each of our lives where we have to answer the question for ourselves, who is Jesus to you? For me, that time came when I was 9 years old in 1974, and I remember it very well. I felt a calling. I felt a tug. I felt a need to drive a stake in the ground. Driving a stake in the ground is an image, is a metaphor for making a claim. You know, when you put that stake in the ground, when I bought my house, they put stakes around the corners of our property. And I've left those stakes there to communicate to my neighbors, hey, this is the property line. And so when you drive that stake in the ground, that's saying, I've made a decision. I'm staking this claim in my life. And I knew that there was a time in my life, I felt it. So I got up off of the back pew where the youth sat one night in a worship gathering, and I dedicated my life. I walked forward and dedicated my life to Jesus as my leader and forgiver. I put that stake in the ground. I answered the question who Jesus was to me. And I knew that I would, at age 9, that I would dedicate my life to living for Him as best I could. I had no idea that meant I would be speaking to you this morning from this place. Actually, at age 9, I kind of thought that it would be just living life like I normally lived life. I would go to church with my parents on Sunday morning. I would come home and, eat dinner at my grandparents'. I never thought about my grandparents dying. I didn't think about any of those kind of things that a 9-year-old doesn't think about. I probably, if I thought I was going to do something with my life in terms of a living, I probably thought that I was going to be indentured on the farm as a farmhand for the rest of my life, because that's what I was doing at the age of 9. I worked. I fed the pigs. I worked the ground. I drove the tractors. I planted corn. I helped combine. I did all of those things that I got hay up. I got straw up. I had to work in the sweat and putting it on the elevator to get into the hayloft. All of that. I gathered eggs, took care of cows. That might have been what I thought. So I went forward that night and I told my pastor, Dwight Miller, of my decision to put a stake in the ground, to make a claim for myself, not for my parents or my grandparents, but to say that I knew who Jesus was and He meant something to me, and it was going to change the way I lived my life. And I knew what would follow. I would be baptized. Our church didn't have a baptistry, they now have the cattle trough like we have. Like what Donovan was baptized in a couple weeks ago up front here. But then they didn't have that. And so we went into a neighboring church, the Easton Church of the Brethren in town. They had a baptistry in the front of their church. They had a hole. Actually, it was up behind the pulpit area. It wasn't a hole in the ground like the Denton Church has. It was up behind, and I was dunked underwater as an outward symbol of this stake that I had driven in the ground. And that wasn't the end. It was a beginning. For some of us, we think that we can't make that claim for who Jesus is in our lives until we get our act together, until we've got it all straight. But if you wait till that time comes, you'll never make that claim. That stake I drove in the ground was a beginning. It was a dance step, and it involves movement forward and movement backward. And every day I am grateful for the grace and the forgiveness of Jesus Christ, because I mess up regularly. I am grateful that I am a beloved mess and that He loves me in spite of the messes of my life. When Jesus was nearing the end of His earthly life, after about 3 years of teaching and demonstrating who He was to His disciples, to His followers, He asked them these 2 questions. The first one's a question that really doesn't matter. I don't know why he asked it, really. I think he just asked it to kind of see what they would say. The first question was, who do people say I am? I mean, Jesus, of all people, knew that it didn't matter what people say we are. I mean, people say all kinds of things about me. People say all kinds of things about you, but that doesn't define who you are. But he asked them, who do people say I am? And they gave him these answers like, you're Jeremiah or Isaiah or some prophet. And I don't really understand that answer, because maybe they thought that they had reincarnated, that he had reincarnated and come back, because all of the answers they gave, all of the people that they gave the answer in their answer had been dead. So what sense did that make? But it didn't matter, because it's a question that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who people say he is. I mean, I knew who my grandparents said Jesus was. I knew who my mom and dad said Jesus was. Also knew who the neighbors down the street said Jesus was. And then none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was who Martin said Jesus was. And the only thing that matters for you is who you say Jesus is. And so that's the very next question Jesus went to. He said, who do you say I am? And it's really interesting that Peter is the one who responds. Now, we know enough about Peter from other stories in the scriptures to know that Peter was impetuous, that Peter jumped up and acted before he thought. And so, I don't know if Peter was thinking, I got to be first, or if he really knew the answer and he wanted to show off. I have no idea. But Peter says to Jesus, he says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. There's Peter driving that stake in the ground. Who do you say I am? Jesus asked. And he asked that question of every one of us. He's asking it of you now. Who is Jesus to you? And what are you going to do with him? What impact, what difference does it make who Jesus is in your life? And it's interesting that Jesus' response to Peter is this. In verse 17 and following, Jesus says, you are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being. It's interesting. Yes, my grandparents and parents taught me about Jesus, but it was that prodding on the back seat in the back row in the church where I grew up that was the Holy Spirit nudging me to make that claim. The same happens for you. And then Peter goes on and says, Jesus goes on and says, now I say to you that you are Peter, which means rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you forbid on earth will be forbidden in heaven, and whatever you permit on earth will be permitted in heaven. Now that's an interesting response to the declaration, to the stake that Peter drives. Upon this rock, I will build my church. Now there's two ways of understanding that. Jesus muddies the water a little bit, and maybe he doesn't. Maybe it's his masterful way of teaching when he says, you are Peter, and I'll call you the rock. So is Jesus saying that the rock on which he's building his church is Peter? Or is the rock on which Jesus is building his church the declaration that Peter made? There's two ways to look at it. If you studied the scriptures at all, you know that Peter and Paul, two very important figures in the formation of the early Christian church, Peter did a lot of planting churches and helping churches to grow in the Gentile world. And so is that what Jesus knew and what he's saying when he says, upon this rock I will build my church? The Catholic Church thinks so. They claim Peter's the first pope. And I'm not saying they're wrong, and I'm not downplaying Peter's significance, but I am going to say this morning that I don't believe that that's the rock that Jesus is building his church on. I don't believe that Jesus built his church on any one person. I correct people all the time when they say your church or Martin's church or Sharon's church. It isn't. And I've already told you several times, numerous times probably throughout these 20 years, that when we first came here and they put our names on the sign that was out front at SCS, Salisbury Christian School, we said, take the names off. It's not about us. It's Jesus' church. We don't want it to be known as Martin and Sharon's church. And so they took our names off. And so I don't think that Jesus is saying that the rock on which he's building his church is Peter. I think he's saying the rock on which the church is built and the rock on which the power of God is unleashed in our world and in our lives is on the declaration that each of us makes to the question of who is Jesus to you? I'm only up here today doing what I'm doing. I'm only in this line of calling because of the power that God has placed in my life when I made that declaration at the age of 9. I had no idea then, but I knew that I would commit my life to following him, that he would lead me throughout life, and he's led me through all these chapters, these various roads. Sometimes it's been forward, sometimes I took the lead and went a different way, and then he pulled me back, or we got back on track. But, it's this power. It happens when we declare that Jesus is the Son of the living God, the Messiah, the Savior of the world, our leader and forgiver. That's the rock on which Jesus builds his church. And here at Community of Joy, we try to model ourselves after that. We have core values. Core values are not words on a wall or words on paper, but they're words that try to dictate, guide how we live our lives. And we say all the time, we have 8 of them, and we say all the time that our very first core value, and always first core value, is always Jesus. All that we do, all that we're about, all that matters is always Jesus. We're driving that stake in the ground. The power of the church is found in Jesus. It's in embracing Jesus. It's living as the hands, feet, and heart of Jesus in the world. And Jesus says that in his response to Peter. In verses 17 through 19, Jesus says, "You are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being. Now I say to you that you are Peter, which means rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the powers of hell will not conquer it. And I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you forbid on earth will be forbidden in heaven, and whatever you permit on earth will be permitted in heaven." God works through us, brothers and sisters, when we stake a claim on who Jesus is. So the important question for each of us is, who do you say I am? Jesus is asking you that. Who is Jesus to you? And as important as that is, that's not the end of the road. It doesn't stop there. You have to answer that question. All of us have to answer that question. And whether we answer it in this life or whether we answer it at the end of this life, when we stand, and I believe all of us will stand before Jesus at one point in our lives, and we'll answer that question. But it's not enough to answer that question with our lips, with our words. We must answer it with our lives too, and that's where Jesus went next. Look at what he did in verses 24 through 28. He said to his disciples, "If any of you want to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? For the Son of Man will come with his angels in the glory of his Father and will judge all people according to their deeds." See, there's where I get that we'll stand in front of him. "And I tell you the truth, some standing here right now will not die before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." You see, we must declare, not just with our words, but we must declare with our lives who Jesus is. I saw that in my grandparents and parents. It wasn't a label that they wore. It was a way of life. Our lives should be different because of our response to the question of who is Jesus to you. And here at Community of Joy, I don't know if you've realized it, but our core values play this out. The first one, as I've already said, is always Jesus. All of them are 2 words except one is 3. And that always Jesus is always first, because all that we do and all that we're about is about Jesus. And that's the declaration. That's the stake in the ground. But then the other core values are ways of life. Open arms. Jesus had open arms, so we should have open arms. Serving hands. Jesus had serving hands, so we should have serving hands. He was found among the broken, so we'll be found among the broken. He loved people in spite of the messes of their lives, so we recognize that we and all people are beloved messes. We risk together because Jesus calls us to risk together. He doesn't call us to a life of comfort and ease. We give back because Jesus gave to us. It's all a way of life. And the final one is transformational circles, getting together, being in circles, learning and becoming transformed. A whole lot of people in our world have declared with their lips that they're Christians, that Jesus is their Lord, but they have not declared it with their lives. It's not an either or, brothers and sisters. It's a both and. And yes, we'll make mistakes. Yes, we're not perfect. As I've already said, I'm grateful for the grace of God every day. But every one of us must answer that question, who do you say I am, with both our words and our lives. Jesus is asking you, who do you say I am? Doesn't matter who he says he is. I mean, it does. But if you don't answer that question, it doesn't. What matters is who you say he is. Who is he to you? And how does that impact the way you live your life? If you've never answered that question, what are you waiting for? There's no better time than today to stake that claim, to begin that journey. Don't wait till you're perfect, because that time never comes. Don't wait till you think you got it all together, because just when you think you got it all together, that's when God humbles you. I can't tell you how many times I thought I had it. I knew exactly what was going to go on. I knew exactly how it was going to happen. And I start boasting about it. And next thing you know, I'm knocked down. I've been humbled. Because it isn't about Martin. And it's not about you. But it is about who you say Jesus is. And how that impacts your life. And it's not just about getting to heaven, brothers and sisters. There's a whole lot of churches that teach that's all it's about. If we can't get along with one another here, if we can't demonstrate love here, if we can't put aside our judgments, if we can't live as Jesus lived and love as Jesus loved here, what makes you think we're going to be able to do it in heaven? It's about here. It's about now. It's about who is Jesus to you. And how does that impact the way you live your lives? If you're feeling a nudge, if you're feeling a push, if you're feeling a call, if you're feeling a tap on the shoulder, and you want to drive that stake today, talk to me afterwards. I'll be happy to talk to you.